Greetings, folks. Welcome to our first discussion of the poetry paper. So I wanted to take a quick look at the assignment a week ahead of time and talk a little bit about how to get started with it. I'm not having you turn in a draft of this particular paper, and I'm not having you do a lot of pre-planning in an official capacity, even though we are doing that on some of the later papers. So I want to spend a little bit extra time kind of talking about how to navigate it. So first and foremost, do not hesitate to reach out with questions. If it's a question about the assignment itself, this is a great opportunity to use the Ask Anything Q&A discussion board. If it is a personal question about something specific with your paper, inbox is probably the best. But you also, of course, have access to tutoring through the library and the Learning Center. You can access that directly on the library's homepage. The Writing Center has a link there, and also the Ask Us button will connect you with a reference librarian. Our own reference librarian, Nora Rackley, knows this assignment well and knows kind of what's up with it. So feel free to reach out to her as well as me, especially if you are not available when I'm available, because sometimes that happens in online classes. So let's talk a little bit about this paper. The assignment is going to look familiar several more times because essentially an analytical research paper about a work of literature does not change that much whether we're writing about a poem or a short story or a novel or a play. However, the formal elements of each of those genres of literature is somewhat different. And when we write about poetry in particular, there's a term that I want you guys to know, which is explication. And a poetry explication is literally a line-by-line analysis of a poem where you go through every line and you talk about the words and you talk about the diction and you talk about any rhyme or rhythm or symbolism or metaphors or similes or any of the things that might come up. So we are explicating a poem, especially if you're writing about a poem that's fairly short. If you're writing about a super long poem, you're not going to be able to go through every single line. But if you're writing about a fairly short poem, which most of the ones we have are, you'll be able to write a true poetry explication. And one of the hallmarks of that is that you're going to end up quoting the poem. So that's built in here. So let me just go over the assignment and then talk a little bit about it. And then we'll have additional information in the following week's module because that's when the paper is actually due. So anyway, this is just a first look. Learners will write a research paper analyzing one or two poems from our course. Most learners should concentrate on just one poem, but if there are two poems that you'd like to compare and contrast on the same theme, that would be acceptable as well. I would really, really, really highly encourage you to stick with one poem. Sometimes, especially if it's a fairly short poem, we think, oh, there's no way I'm going to be able to write about it, but I promise you, you can. Okay. There's my sales pitch. Requirements are, of course, it's an MLA paper. So MLA format, documentation of all the sources, including the poem or poems. You're going to have that detailed analysis or explication of the poem or poems. And then you are going to need to have some secondary research from at least two academic/library sources. Now, remember, and I've been having you read those as we've gone, for each of the poems in the library guide, there are sources provided. So you can do additional research if you want to, but you can also use the sources that are right there in the LibGuide. So you don't have to go traipsing all over the universe to find information. The paper itself should be at least 4 pages, so a little bit longer than your last paper. But of course, you're also quoting almost a whole poem, which will mean now your works cited page will be on page 6 or higher. So when writing a poetry explication, unless you choose a poem that is very long, you will likely end up quoting the entire poem. And there's really 2 ways to do this. And I want you use what makes the most sense to you. I also want you to use what makes most sense with your poem. So generally, if your poem is broken down into separate stanzas, it makes sense to quote a stanza and then discuss it. And you go back and forth doing that throughout the body of the paper. For poems that are all one piece, say sometimes a sonnet that doesn't have any line breaks in it or anything, then it makes sense to have the introduction and then quote the poem and then get into the explication. Now, if you do that, if you have a big chunk of poem right at the beginning there, single space that poem. I know it's not MLA, but otherwise it just looks so weird and it's really hard to follow. What you write about the poem should be 4 pages. So the paper, of course, could be much longer depending on the length of the poem. Now, what do you want to cover? You can cover anything that you want, but I've listed here the formal literary aspects so you can talk about the speaker, who the audience is, who the poem's directed at, form, or freedom from form. If it's more of that kind of free-flowing sort of poetry, you could talk about that as well. Rhyme or lack of rhyme, rhythm or lack of regular rhythm, the diction, the language, is it flowery? Is it simple? Is it is there humor in it? Is it sarcastic? Is there irony in it? What is the language doing? Theme, of course, is going to be important, but typically it's not that hidden, right? That we know right away if it's going to be, oh, this is a love poem, or oh, this is a poem about religion. And of course, figurative language. Poetry uses a lot of similes, metaphors, symbolism, things of that nature. So that's, of course, also with the theme where it comes into if you wanted to do a comparison contrast of 2 poems that are both about love or both about religion or both about death or whatever, that is another way that you can go about doing it. And typically when we do that, we would not have the poems intermixed. Essentially, you would write everything about one poem, everything about the other poem. Within that, I want you to include not only your own interpretation, but I want you to include some information from literary criticism. Now, you don't have to write about it from one of the theoretical or critical lenses that we looked at way back in the beginning, but you certainly can. So especially if it is a poem that is centered around a particular cultural significant thing, such as marriage or love or even death, you could talk about that in a sociological cultural lens. Gender and sexuality, of course, play into poetry as well. You'll see a lot of poetic criticism that is in the mythological and psychological realm as well, because of the ties to mythology and other works of literature, things of that nature. So you can use those, but you also just want to remember that if you're reading literary criticism, they might be coming at it through one of those lenses. So that's another kind of way that you can work that in. But you don't have to feel like you have to do those. So what I would suggest in terms of getting prepared is to, first of all, of course, pick a poem. Go ahead and start gathering some sources. Could be the sources that are already there. You might want to look for some just inspirational things as well to kind of help you decide what aspects of it that you want to talk about. And go ahead and start doing that analysis of your own on the poem. And then that way, if you have that already started by the beginning of next week, you can certainly check in with me if you have questions. That'll give us a chance to maybe look at it together before it's time to turn the final paper in. On the other papers that are coming up, you're going to be doing some of this in a more formal way. You're going to give me your thesis and your outline and stuff, but I wanted you to have the opportunity to just do this without too much stress. And if you have some questions, we can certainly talk about it. But I will be back with you again, so don't worry about it. Just kind of keep this on your radar for now, because we are going to be doing it next week. And of course, when you are reviewing the assignment, the rubric is right there as well. So everybody take care, and I will see you back next week for more information on the poetry paper. Everybody have a great one.